Coronavirus is everywhere in the news, and people are seeing the disaster that's starting to unfold and across many, many nations and many countries, and will affect eventually the entire globe. So all of mankind is being affected by this at some way or another, at a different stage, maybe from each other, but all part of that same process of this unstoppable force that's spreading everywhere and causing immense suffering, death, and destruction. So what are we up against really? And in this video, we're gonna investigate this, and I think it's essential to understand that we are dealing with a super virus. Um, and I will demonstrate this both by looking at the characteristics and also the accumulation of evidence that seems to point to this virus not being some kind of a natural occurrence, but rather more, I will make the case here that this is in fact a bioweapon that has been leaked accidentally from a lab inside Wuhan in China. And there's been a cover up by the Communist Party because obviously for them, if it comes out that they are responsible through ineptitude, corruption, incompetence for an accident similar to Chernobyl, but a million times worse in terms of scope, it would obviously spell the end of their regime. So that's also why there was a cover up. And this also helped the drama unfold and spread itself further, not just in Wuhan, but elsewhere. So let's look at it right now together. I think it's essential for every individual, everyone who's looking at this video, you have to think, we need to understand the threat to be able to, we need to be able to process the information properly, because if we don't understand what we're dealing with, we cannot take the proper mindset, the proper attitude to be willing to change our habits, to do what it takes to kind of manage this crisis and go through it and survive and come out at the other end victorious. So until people start to accept and understand the reality that in the most likely understanding, we are in fact dealing with a super virus, which is a weapon of mass destruction that's been leaked by mistake and that is now affecting the entire world, we will not take this seriously enough. That's my position. So I've done a lot of research, and there are many findings. So first of all, at first the Communist Party was selling the lie that it was coming from the wet market in Wuhan, and all it's been demonstrated by really credible Western medical journals that there was at least 30% of the initial patients that had nothing to do with the wet market. They were nowhere near the wet market in any way. And in fact, they were infected prior to even the first cases that came out of the wet market. Now, think about it. How many wet markets are there in Asia? Like hundreds, thousands? How many BSL-4 labs are there in Asia? There's only one. A biosafety level 4 lab is the highest clearance of lab for pathogenic research. And they deal with P4 pathogens like coronaviruses. And China didn't have one until a couple of years ago. And the biomedical community, the biological warfare community were warning that China should not be allowed to have that because of there's too big a risk of an accident. And so there's only one such lab in all of Asia. It happens to be in Wuhan, where the epicenter of the original outbreak happened, the initial hotspot. That's still ongoing now. There's news leaking out of China. People, they're just reestablished a full quarantine, a full lockdown. Some reports are coming in even today that their hospital are still full. So there's like this double narrative where on one side you have the Communist Chinese Party information coming out that everything's fine, they're the best in the world, and we have to understand these people are radical humanists, so they're capable of anything basically in order to stay themselves in power, and they have their sympathizers out in the West. We even have this Canadian guy from the World Health Organization saying he would rather be treated in China. While we see people being brought in cages by force or being bolted to their doors, left basically on their own, unable to get out of their house to get supplies or anything. And so We got this whitewash coming in from a certain group of people in the West that are hook, like, and sinker falling for the Soviet Chinese narrative. And I think this is a mistake. The way these radical humanist regimes operate is they don't try to convince you of their lies. They just spread many, many lies, many false narratives so that it obfuscates the real one. And then you're paralyzed. You're unable to react or act properly because there's so much noise that you can't see which one is the correct one. Well, I make the case right here, right now, that the right one, the one that we have to work with as the reasonable worst case scenario situation, is that we're dealing with a super virus, a bioweapon that was leaked accidentally, a la Chernobyl, but multiple times worse, and that this was leaked somehow, some through some, maybe we don't know how, but we know there's a bunch of evidence accumulating showing that it seems to be what's happening. So let's go through them quickly together. So at first, there was this initial patient, and he was bed stricken. He was in a hospital, the patient zero, and they wouldn't give out information about who that person was interacting with. So right there, that's the dead end from which everything started. Then we have the CCP that were covering up for over a month the fact that it was human to human transmissible. And so people in Wuhan were going about their daily lives. This could have been avoided, but because they wanted to cover it up, it spread like wildfire. And then it became a nightmare there because even the numbers that they're giving out are very likely very false by orders of magnitude, probably 100 times worse. So maybe today they have 10 million infected and 500,000 dead. That seems more reasonable than the numbers they're dishing out. And the rest of the world is catching up to it slowly but surely. So we'll see where that goes. It doesn't look good at all. So I would advise everybody to take it very seriously. Now, we know that there was this cover up. So they have this motive to cover up if it's a leak, which is obviously what I think is happening there. And then the lead virologist of that Wuhan BSL-4 lab was known to have been working on coronaviruses and enhancing them to make them more lethal. So that's crazy stuff, and it was being denounced. And the rest of the world said we have to ban this kind of research, and they did. But China was ongoing with it. There's a Mossad agent that did confirm that in the intelligence community, it's kind of a well-known fact that China has this covert biowarfare program that they're using to kind of test and make things worse by mixing and matching different generations of viruses together. And we can imagine, like, the second thing that happened is this whole BSL-4 lab being built by China, in Wuhan, was done as a partnership with France, where socialists in France, they partnered up with their humanist friends from the radical regime of the dictatorship in China, and they supported them to get that. And just when they were about to finally build everything, China, I think Xi Jinping stepped in and said, you know what, we won't be using that costly French firm that's so used to doing that kind of quality work. I know we'll have a local Chinese firm do it, and there was basically no quality control checks at that point. It could have introduced many design flaws that helped introduce a leak. It could be an accumulation of human error. I think if you watch the Chernobyl TV series that came out last year, you see a kind of accumulation of human errors, and this is compounded by the chronic and systematic ineptitude, corruption, incompetence that surrounds these kinds of socialist communist regimes and mentalities. So it's very likely that this is what we're dealing with at this point. So much so that it has to be the working understanding from which we operate. We have to digest this and say, well, you know what? There's a valid chance that this is true. So I'm starting from now, I'm going to take this more seriously. I'm going to deal with it like what it probably is. And that would explain a lot about the deadly characteristics, which are a mishmash of all the worst combinations you could imagine to have maximum effect in terms of destruction and devastation. So I'm not done, though, with the evidence surrounding the whole bioweapon leak approach. The lead virologist also, on top of this, was asked at some point whether it was a leak from the lab, and she said, I would rather die than it be from the lab ever. So that's not like the kind of argumentative logic that you would expect from a rational scientist. That's like the crazy talk of a radical brainwash, and who's more focused on loyalty to the party and basically is sidestepping the question, not avoiding not at all answering and avoiding the obvious answer, yes, no. So this is very disconcerting to hear that coming from that person. And then that person seems to have been removed and replaced by the most senior officer in the Chinese army for biowarfare. So they put that person in charge of Wuhan, the lab there. And then there's many brave, courageous, like individual Chinese people who are reporting clandestinely across Wuhan and elsewhere and leaking their stuff through VPNs to the rest of the world, to the free world. And one such person was caught. He would last video he sent was exactly about this. He had just been to the BSL-4 lab in Wuhan, and he reported that everything was shut down there. There was no activity. Everything was shut down. There was no one there, and he was running away from cops by car, and he was broadcasting this as they were chasing him. And that's the last we heard of him. He basically got arrested at some point and disappeared after that. So that's also thank you to him. I hope he's still okay. Um, and what that means to us is, why would they close the only best lab to do some kind of vaccine research or antibody research right now, unless there had been something extremely wrong there? And the last evidence I want to convey right now, I'm not saying there's probably more. I don't know everything, but the last one I want to convey is there was a senior meeting of all the Politburo senior communist leadership with Xi, and they came up. One of the first things they did was they came up, and I don't know, remember when, a couple of weeks ago, with a new set of directives that said they're going to review entirely their security procedures inside biosafety research labs, so that it would be uh, completely revised. So why would they come up with such a timing unless there was something that happened, something massive bad happened out of this? And the people of Wuhan have been paying for it ever since. There are some horror stories. If you care enough, you can go out online and look at all those leaks. I think even mainstream media has been broadcasting them. So yeah, you got that picture right here, and we have to be intellectually courageous enough to kind of digest and process this and say, yeah, you know what? I think we might be dealing with a super virus. I think we might be dealing with a Chernobyl-like bioweapons leak that's going to affect the entire world, because it's a designed virus that has the characteristics and traits that make it really an effective weapon of mass destruction. So who would have thought that the entire world would be subjected to dealing and with managing a situation involving a weapon of mass destruction at a global scale right now in our generation in 2020. Well, here we are. That's what I'm telling you. I think if you can make that pivot in your mind and start taking into account that this is a very clear and present danger, an imminent threat that we are confronted with, you'll be much more effective after that to start planning and acting appropriately to react to this. And so we can get through it, first of all, by saving ourselves individually and then collectively, and overcoming the threat permanently later on, because it's very challenging. So to resume it, we're dealing with a looming crisis, because this is what I qualify as an endemic global pandemic. So the word endemic here is extremely important. It is unprecedented. There's no natural immunity in the human population for this virus. So people can catch it over and over. So you may be spared. You may not catch it, but eventually you get it. Then you get better, and then you go back to normal, and then you get reinfected. So there's no end to this technically. The fact that it's endemic, that people can catch it over and over, and it's well documented. There's multiple cases of people catching it more than once, and it means that it's going to stall our economies indefinitely. And so the consequences are socially, humanly, and economically can be disastrous, cataclysmic. We'll get to that. I have a bunch of videos later that are going to come up and touch on this. So now let's talk about the characteristics of the virus itself. Let's talk about that right now, because they complement the other set of information. So let's talk first about the incubation period. This virus is different from the Spanish flu, and it's worse than the Spanish flu because it has a long incubation period. The Spanish flu, you would catch it a couple hours later, you had symptoms, a day later you were dead. So there was not much chance for the virus to transmit itself. Even then, it was still able to kill up to 50 million people. And that was way back in 1918, where the world population was much lower. Second, so instead of spreading, instead we're dealing with an incubation period here for this super virus that is between like 2 to 3 weeks. So the person will not even be showing symptoms for 2 to 3 weeks. Normally, a virus will not be infectious or transmissible during that period where it's incubating inside a human body. However, this virus has this extra trait where it is capable of asymptomatic transmission, and that's what's making it impossible to contain. And a lot of countries simply chose to kind of not do anything about it and try to just mitigate the situation in other ways rather than try containment. But containment is good because a lot of countries have been successful thus far at dealing it, controlling it. And there's a ton of measures like the ones that the Chinese did. Like I'm not saying they didn't stop it. They really slowed it to a crawl and paralyzed the virus by putting the entire country on lockdown basically. And now they're trying to restart the country. But as I'm saying, the endemic side of things is going to catch back. It's going to bring back infections. When you try the economic restart, get people out again. If you do it too soon, uh, you have a problem. It might come back. You might have local transmission happening again, new hotspots popping up. So that's a problem. And the fact that it's asymptomatic transmission capable means that people they're not even self-aware that they have the virus. They go see their family, their friends, their parents. They travel, they go on cruises, they take the plane. They give it to other people without even knowing that they're doing it. And then the other people, they have a lag also of 2 to 3 weeks before they show symptoms. So this virus is then able to spread really rapidly that way. In fact, there is a very credible team of scientists from the Los Alamos Research Lab in New Mexico in the US. They came up with a stat. They say the R naught, which is like the transmission factor, is at 6.5 on this beast. So 6.5, that means that the infection rate, the infections double every 2.5 days, basically. It's an extremely fast number for infections to grow. Of course, this is mitigated by measures such as lockdowns in countries where they tell everybody to just stay home. And ideally, you'd like people to stay home long enough that this thing just dies on its own, where people develop their antibodies and deal with it at home, and then it cannot transmit further, and eventually it dies down completely. But unless you're going to block your borders, there's new infected people that are going to come in, and you're going to restart the cycle over and over until it kind of self-destructs civilization entirely, potentially. So that's a huge concern. But human innovation and human adaptiveness is able to deal with this. We will deal with this, so don't freak out. But we do have to take this rationally, seriously, and this is why this video is all about really setting the stage for the gravity of the situation. And let's talk now about some other characteristics of that super virus, because they're also very important for you guys to become aware of. And the lethality of the virus is extremely higher than the common flu. The common flu is like 0.01, and we're dealing here with 5%. And 5% in optimal conditions where the health systems are not overwhelmed, where you have enough ICU beds for everybody. So that in Italy, it took like 2 days before they ran out of beds. Now the hospitals are at 200% capacity. They have to choose who they're going to treat. So that's not a good situation. And then the next stage is, as we saw in Wuhan, for those who care enough, they were watching that, the medical staff gets infected too. And then you need to kind of replace the frontline workers. They get smashed out of service, and you have to bring in new people to deal with it in the hotspot. But if you completely lose control and it's the whole nation is affected like this, you're just going to run out of staff for the healthcare system, and you're facing a broader collapse of the ability to deal with the crisis, which I hope people will be able to avoid. Obviously, that's the desired outcome. But we can't base our logic on hope right now. We have to stick with the facts. So 5% lethality, that's the generic number. But what we have to know is that there's another 5% that are going to experience sepsis. This is a technical term which means organ failure, and it could be the renal functions, the lungs, the heart. So the virus goes very deep within the organ, and the immune system kind of overreacts and tries to go back in and try to get to those virus particles. And in so doing, it paralyzes the organ, prevents it from working properly. So the lungs can't breathe enough oxygen. You got lesions developing out of all the outcome of that injection of immune reaction, and people develop severe critical symptoms and they die basically out of this unless they have extremely good care. Again, those people, as soon as the healthcare system is overwhelmed, they're kind of falling into the death rate, increasing it to 10%. And then you have another segment of another 10% of people that get severe symptoms. We're talking pneumonia like symptoms and double lung pneumonia, which is extremely dangerous. Like most people, you wouldn't want to stay home when you get that. You would want to go to the emergency and get some medical assistance. Again, this is stuff that people will have to deal with, and the healthcare system being overwhelmed. Those people are also at risk of dying, and so that's the picture we're dealing with. So that's really bad as of itself. Like, let's assume for a moment that the healthcare system is working. How many people will die from this on average? We can infer this number actually. There's leading epidemiologists from around the free world, from Hong Kong, the UK, the USA, in senior positions within the health agencies they work for, uh, that have communicated the same message. They think, based on their experience, we're talking about people that went frontline for Ebola, SARS, and other live outbreaks. And that's their career, and so they're the experts, and they're all saying the same thing, that between half and up to 80%, between half and 2/3 of the world population, one of them even says up to 80% of the world population will get infected by this. So that's how pessimistic they are about it. In spite of government interventions, in spite of all the best efforts, we are ill-equipped with the resources to kind of manage this socially and culturally, and just technologically. We're not equipped right now to deal with this appropriately. And it's so virulent, it's so transmissive, so infectious, that they believe that up to 80% of the world population might get infected. So if we run the numbers on this, 5% of the world population, maybe it's like 5 billion, and then you have 5% of those that die, we're talking about 200 million plus. And that's as I was saying, that's assuming the ideal health system conditions, where everybody with severe or critical symptoms are right there in the ICU when they get their seizures, to get treated by the right people at the right time with the right equipment, which is extremely unlikely. So we're talking a death rate that could be much higher, maybe 500 million worldwide. Take it seriously. Take it seriously now. My next video is going to be about immediate preventive measures to help you individually, along with your your close loved ones, make it through this. Like, how do we survive this situation first of all, and then we'll look at the other stages later. But the immediate stage is just taking effective actions to shield ourselves from the risks, and there's quite a few that can be done and must be done. Otherwise, you risk putting yourself or other people near you in great danger and danger of death. So we want to avoid this whenever possible. Information can help us through this. So this is what the next video is about. So I advise you to please take a look also when it comes out soon. I hope it helps. So I think I've done pretty much a good rounder of what we're dealing with here. And I would just like to add before I end that you have this 500 million reasonable potential worst case planning scenario. And it could be worse than this, because as we can imagine, all those countries shutting down, the disruptions to the supply chain, all the economic upheaval, the chaos that's coming surrounding this as a result of this, the geopolitical destabilizations, all of this can increase the death count dramatically as well. I mean, we could be dealing with all those other medical conditions that people have that are unrelated to the disease, but yet untreated and result in more deaths. They won't be directly counted initially. But once we finish everything, we could be looking at 1 billion people dying from this. And then it may not be even over. This is endemic. And I don't want to make you too depressed, but there's all these firms and these research universities that are saying, "Oh, we have a vaccine. We'll get one done in a couple of weeks, or it's already done." But they're only talking about trial vaccines that are perfectly ineffective and dangerous even to the health of humans. And this is a SARS-like virus with some HIV components in its DNA code, and both SARS and HIV. I mean, SARS, they've been working on vaccines for it for over 15 years it's a complete waste. And then HIV, they've been working on a vaccine for that for decades, and it's a complete waste. These are all RNA viruses. RNA viruses, they're really sloppy when it comes to duplicating themselves, so that they mutate a bit every time. So they were saying, oh, there's a few strains, so the more dangerous strain in Italy, less in Korea, China's fine. That's, to me, that's like obfuscation again. We're going to deal with dozens of strains, hundreds of strains. It's going to keep mutating back and forth in minor ways, but overall, it's going to maintain its deadly efficacy no matter what. You're going to get multi-infected by the harmless strains, by the deadly strains. It's going to spread in every way, everywhere, in the same approach, and we have to take it seriously no matter what. So yeah, countries like Singapore, Korea are better equipped culturally to deal with this. Good for them, and they should keep up the fight. Some other places are less equipped. They're making mistakes when they treat people that amplify the death rate. That's really concerning to me. So I want to educate you guys about what to avoid, what to go for when it comes to this, because I've done a lot of research on it. I think we got a picture here. We're dealing with a super virus, a bioweapon leak, a la Chernobyl, a million times worse. It's an endemic global pandemic. Just sleep on those words. Watch the video again if you wake up thinking that it's no biggie tomorrow. And we need to be ahead of the curve on this. And I think until we as individuals and then as collectives become self-aware enough about the real danger posed by this threat to our existence, we won't be acting seriously enough. We won't have the will to change our habits enough to tell other people around us to care enough. So that's why this video was made here. I hope it helps light a switch inside you to say, you know what, I'm going to take this very seriously from now on. And remember, every generation has their challenge. So this is ours. This is one of our challenges in our generation. Other generations have had horrible things to deal with. Maybe what we have to dealing, maybe what we're forced to deal with something that's even worse than anything before it. But we can do this, and we will. And this makes life interesting. Let's bring out the best of ourselves. Let's step forward right now and do our best, be at our best game to deal with this and make it a nice story at the end of the day, that we can wake up from better people and a better civilization out of this mess. Thank you. And remember, last thing, if you can, like it, subscribe, share. I would greatly appreciate it. Comment. I have a Patreon channel if you want to ask me questions. And if you want me to make videos specific to a given question, it's through Patreon. But any kind of activity you can help to share, as you see, this is a new channel, I will greatly appreciate. I'm grateful, thankful for you for even watching. Thank you for that. So cheers, and until next time.